My name is Emma. I'm in my mid-30s, and for most of my adult life, I've worked inside organizations that pride themselves on being people first. I'm not loud. I don't dominate meetings. I don't build my identity around being seen. I do my work carefully, consistently, and with an almost stubborn sense of responsibility. That's usually how people describe me too. Dependable, calm, low maintenance. Someone who doesn't make problems. If you asked my colleagues how they saw me, many would probably say I was solid. Not brilliant, not difficult, not political. The kind of person you trust with complex work, but don't worry too much about managing emotionally. And I think that perception is exactly why this story unfolded the way it did. This is a story about recognition that didn't translate into respect. About applause that echoed in a room while something quieter and more consequential was being taken away elsewhere. The title says it plainly. My company praised me publicly, then quietly cut my bonus. Or, as it felt in my body at the time, the applause was loud. The paycheck was not. What you'll hear is not a revenge story. There's no shouting, no dramatic resignation, no villain monologues. I didn't slam doors or expose anyone on social media. What happened instead was slower, quieter, and much more revealing about power, about assumptions, and about what happens when people mistake silence for consent. This story moves through a few emotional terrains. At first, there's pride, the genuine kind that comes from knowing you did good work and that it mattered. Then confusion, when numbers don't match words. Then a long stretch of self-questioning, where you wonder if you misunderstood, if you're being ungrateful, if staying quiet is the more professional choice. And eventually, there's clarity. Not the cinematic kind, but the calm, irreversible kind where you see the system exactly as it is and understand your place in it. I want to be clear about something up front. I'm telling this story to be honest, not dramatic. There's no fantasy of humiliation or poetic justice here. What unfolded didn't feel triumphant in the moment. It felt precise, almost clinical. And that's why it changed me. As you listen, you might recognize pieces of your own experience. Maybe you've been praised in meetings but sidelined in decisions. Maybe you've been told you're valued while your compensation, growth, or boundaries quietly shrink. Or maybe you're someone who's always been taught that staying calm and agreeable will eventually be rewarded. This is not a story about becoming louder. It's about becoming clearer. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something, gently and without pressure. Have you ever felt appreciated in words, but diminished in outcomes? To them, I was the steady one, not the visionary, not the fire starter, not the name people dropped when leadership wanted to signal innovation. I was the person things passed through quietly and came out cleaner on the other side. Processes, deadlines, problems no one wanted to own. I was the person you CC'd when something mattered but didn't need applause. I joined the company in my late 20s, when I still believed effort naturally translated into fairness. It was a growing organization, the kind that loved phrases like culture fit and shared values. From the outside, it looked healthy. From the inside, it felt busy, ambitious, and slightly chaotic. That chaos became my entry point. I wasn't hired to be visible. I was hired to stabilize. Over time, my role expanded without ever being officially redefined. I learned how departments actually functioned, not how they were described in slides. I knew which deadlines were real and which were ceremonial. I knew who needed reminders framed as favors and who needed silence framed as trust. None of this was written down. It lived in my head, my notebook, and my habits. People noticed, but not in a way that made me central. They noticed in sentences like, "Emma will handle it," or "Let's check with Emma, she knows how this works," or my least favorite, "She's great at just getting things done." I was dependable, reliable, low friction, and because I didn't push back publicly, I was also safe. That safety became part of my identity at work. I didn't dominate meetings. I listened, summarized, clarified. I asked questions that helped others sound sharper. When credit was distributed vaguely, I didn't interrupt to specify. When decisions were made above my head using my work as scaffolding, I told myself that influence mattered more than recognition. I wasn't unhappy. That's important to say. I was respected in a quiet, utilitarian way. People trusted me with sensitive tasks. Leadership looped me in when something needed to be handled delicately. New hires were told, "If you're confused, ask Emma." I trained people who would later outrank me. I filled gaps no one acknowledged as gaps. And I believed, honestly believed, that this was how long-term value was built. What I didn't realize then was how clearly my role had been defined by others. Not by title, but by expectation. I was the person who would absorb pressure without reflecting it back. The person who would smooth rough edges instead of pointing at who caused them. The person who would accept praise as a substitute for leverage. Invisibility doesn't arrive all at once. It's gradual. It feels like trust at first. The more competent I became, the less visible my contributions seemed. Systems ran better, so problems appeared smaller. Crises were prevented, so there was nothing dramatic to credit. When something worked, it felt natural, inevitable even. When something failed, it was noticeable. That asymmetry teaches you to be careful, to stay measured, to never make mistakes that can be traced. So I became precise. I documented quietly. I tracked outcomes. I noticed patterns in how resources were allocated versus how gratitude was expressed. I noticed who negotiated and who didn't. Who was rewarded for potential, and who was rewarded with more work. Still, I didn't see myself as undervalued. Not yet, because every so often, something happened that reinforced the story I was telling myself. A public thank you in a meeting. A leadership email praising my dedication. A comment about how lucky the team was to have me. These moments mattered to me more than I like to admit. They felt like confirmation that patience was a strategy, not a weakness. Looking back, I can see how neatly I fit the role they needed filled. I was not threatening. I was not demanding. I did not take up space emotionally or politically. I was useful without being disruptive. And usefulness, when it's consistent and quiet, often gets mistaken for something that doesn't need to be compensated, only acknowledged. At the time, though, I would have told you I was exactly where I wanted to be. Trusted, respected, essential even. I just didn't yet understand the difference between being essential to the work and being essential to the people making decisions. And I didn't yet know how expensive that misunderstanding would become. The first sign wasn't dramatic. That's what made it easy to dismiss. It came wrapped in good news. We were in an all-hands meeting, one of those carefully staged gatherings where leadership talked about momentum, resilience, and the people who make this place work. I hadn't expected my name to come up, so when it did, I felt a brief, warm surprise, like being seen from across a crowded room. My manager spoke about a project I'd led quietly for months. A complicated operational overhaul that reduced errors, saved money, and, most importantly to leadership, happened without disrupting anyone's comfort. He called it a textbook example of ownership. People nodded. Someone clapped. Then more people clapped. I smiled, felt my shoulders relax, felt proud in a restrained way. The applause was loud. A few weeks later, bonus letters went out. I opened mine at my desk between meetings, expecting nothing extravagant. Just alignment. Words and numbers moving in the same direction. That felt reasonable. Earned, even. They weren't. The bonus was smaller than the year before. Not by a lot. Just enough to make me pause. Just enough to trigger that quiet, sinking recalculation in your chest. I reread the number. Checked the performance period. Looked for a typo. There wasn't one. At first, I assumed there was a logical explanation. Budget tightening, a company-wide adjustment. Maybe bonuses were weighted differently this year. These things happen. I'd been around long enough to know that praise and compensation don't always move in sync. Still, something didn't sit right. The project they'd applauded publicly had exceeded its targets. My performance review had been strong, warm language, no red flags. And yet, the outcome didn't reflect that story. It wasn't punishment. It wasn't neglect either. It was something quieter, more surgical. I considered asking about it. I even drafted a message in my head. Calm, professional, curious. But every version sounded like I was complaining. Or worse, that I didn't get it. So I did what I'd always done. I waited. In conversations around the office, bonuses came up in passing. People compared notes indirectly. Some were pleased. Some were confused. No one seemed angry. No one seemed alarmed. And because no one else was reacting strongly, I told myself I shouldn't either. This is how small cuts work. They don't announce themselves as injuries. They present as inconveniences, misunderstandings, rounding errors. They rely on your instinct to be reasonable. I reminded myself of the praise, of the trust, of the long view. I told myself that this was just one data point, not a pattern, that my value wasn't defined by a single line item, but I wrote the number down anyway. Not out of resentment, out of curiosity. I started paying closer attention, not just to my own situation, but to how recognition flowed through the organization, who got praised publicly, who got rewarded privately, who received stretch opportunities, who was told to be patient. What I noticed wasn't blatant unfairness. It was something more socially acceptable. A kind of selective generosity. Bold rewards for visible risk takers. Gentle appreciation for stabilizers. And subtle financial restraint applied to the people least likely to push back. No one told me I was worth less. They didn't have to. The system spoke in adjustments, not declarations. At the time, I still believed the best response was consistency. Keep doing good work. Stay professional. Trust that things even out over time. I hadn't yet learned that systems rarely correct what isn't challenged, and they almost never reward silence with retroactive fairness. But I wasn't angry, not yet. I was attentive. And that attentiveness would matter later. After the bonus, nothing changed on the surface. And that, more than anything, made it easy to normalize what had happened. No one treated me differently. No one avoided my eyes. There were no awkward pauses or sudden coldness. In fact, if anything, the praise increased. Leadership continued to reference my work as an example of how things should be done. My manager leaned on me more heavily. I was invited into more conversations, more planning sessions, more quiet problem-solving spaces. It would have been easier if the disrespect had been loud. Instead, it came in the form of expectations that expanded without negotiation. Responsibilities that grew without titles changing. Requests framed as compliments. We trust you with this. You're the only one who really understands it. This needs a steady hand. Each time I said yes, I told myself this was growth. That impact mattered more than labels. That visibility would follow value eventually. And every time I felt a flicker of doubt, I countered it with logic. They wouldn't rely on me this much if they didn't respect me. They wouldn't praise me if they didn't appreciate me. This is how you learn to rationalize imbalance. I started noticing how often my role was described in emotional terms rather than strategic ones. Dependable. Grounded. Calm under pressure. These are good qualities, but they're also safe ones. They don't imply ambition or authority. They imply containment. When new initiatives were discussed, I was asked to support, not lead. When decisions were made using my analysis, my name wasn't attached to the outcome. When timelines were aggressive, I was expected to absorb the strain quietly, because I always had. And because I didn't protest, the system adjusted around that expectation. I remember one moment in particular. A colleague, well-meaning, not unkind, thanked me for always being so flexible. He said it like it was a virtue, like it was something to admire. I smiled and nodded, but something inside me tightened. Flexibility, in that context, meant I would bend so others wouldn't have to. Still, I stayed quiet. Part of it was pride. I didn't want to seem petty or transactional. I believed professionalism meant not counting every slight. Another part was fear, though I didn't recognize it as such at the time. Fear of being seen as difficult. Fear of disrupting the image I'd built. Fear that if I asked for more, the answer would confirm what I was starting to suspect. So I adjusted my expectations instead. I told myself that not everyone needs to climb. That stability is its own form of success. That some people are builders, not flag bearers. These stories helped me make peace with the gap between effort and reward. They sounded mature, self-aware, reasonable. But beneath them was a quieter truth. I was being trained to accept less, not less work, less recognition that mattered, less financial alignment, less say. And the training was effective because it didn't feel like coercion. It felt like culture. The more I normalized it, the more invisible the line became. The line between being valued and being used. Between being trusted and being taken for granted. Between choosing silence and being silenced by default. What I didn't see yet was that every time I rationalized a dismissal, I was reinforcing a role others had already assigned me. The role of the one who wouldn't make noise. The one who would keep things running without asking what it cost her. I thought I was being patient. In reality, I was being predictable. And predictability, in systems like this, is rarely rewarded. It's exploited. Still, nothing had broken yet. Nothing had forced a reckoning. The disrespect remained subtle enough to ignore, and I remained skilled enough to make it all look effortless. But something was accumulating. Not anger, not resentment. Awareness. It didn't arrive as a revelation. It arrived as a pattern. Once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. There was a specific way people spoke to me, and a different way they spoke about me. To my face, I was thanked, reassured, praised for my support and reliability. In rooms where I wasn't present, decisions were made that assumed my cooperation as a given. Timelines were set with my capacity already baked in. Risks were taken with the quiet confidence that I would absorb the fallout. I wasn't consulted about whether I could carry more. I was informed that I would. That was the role, the reliable one. The stabilizer. The person who made ambitious plans possible by smoothing their rough edges afterward. I wasn't expected to challenge direction or redefine scope. I was expected to execute, adjust, and endure. And I had trained them well. I had responded to pressure with composure, to unfairness with understanding, to imbalance with silence. Each time, the system learned something about me, that I could be leaned on without resistance. What made it more difficult to confront was that no one was malicious. There were no villains, just incentives, just habits, just a hierarchy that rewarded visibility and risk-taking, and quietly extracted value from those who kept everything from falling apart. I remember sitting in a planning meeting, listening to a senior leader outline a new initiative. It was ambitious, under-resourced, and, based on my experience, structurally fragile. As he spoke, eyes flicked toward me briefly, then away. Not asking, assuming. I said nothing, not because I didn't have an opinion, but because I knew exactly how that conversation would go. If I raised concerns, I would be told I was being cautious. If I proposed solutions, I would be tasked with implementing them. Either way, the direction wouldn't change. Only my workload would increase. So I stayed quiet, and in that quiet, the role solidified. It wasn't written in my job description, but it was deeply understood. I was the person who would make it work, who would quietly fix what hadn't been thought through, who would take responsibility without taking credit. And because I did it well, the role felt justified. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from being seen as endlessly capable, but rarely considered. It's not burnout, it's erosion. A slow wearing away of your sense that fairness is part of the equation. I started to notice how often my boundaries were assumed rather than respected. How often my time was treated as flexible simply because I hadn't defended it loudly. How often praise replaced negotiation. The bonus cut began to make sense in that context. Not as a punishment, but as an adjustment. A recalibration based on perceived tolerance. I wasn't seen as someone who would leave over money, or push back, or disrupt the narrative. I was seen as safe. And safety, in some organizations, is rewarded with dependency, not advancement. Once I understood that, something shifted internally, not outwardly. I didn't change my behavior yet. I didn't confront anyone or demand anything. I just stopped lying to myself about the role I was playing. I saw how neatly I fit into their expectations. How much of my identity at work was shaped by what I allowed, not just what I contributed. And for the first time, I asked myself a question I had avoided for years. If this is the role they've assigned me, and the rewards that come with it, am I willing to keep playing it? I didn't answer right away, but the question stayed. The shift didn't happen in a meeting. It didn't come from an email or a confrontation. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, in a moment so quiet it almost didn't register. I was reviewing a quarterly report, one I had essentially built from scratch, when I noticed a familiar pattern. My analysis had been lifted almost verbatim into a deck prepared by someone else. The framing was the same. The conclusions were the same. Even the phrasing was close enough that I recognized my own thinking in it. What was missing was my name. That, on its own, wasn't new. I'd seen versions of this before, but something about this instance felt different. Not sharper, not more insulting, just clearer. I leaned back in my chair and reread the section slowly, as if I were seeing it from the outside. There was no anger in me, no spike of emotion, just a kind of neutral recognition, like identifying a familiar landmark from a distance. This is how it works. In that moment, I realized I had stopped expecting fairness, and that realization unsettled me more than the unfairness itself. I thought about the applause, the bonus, the expanding responsibilities, the praise that never seemed to translate into leverage. And I understood, with uncomfortable clarity, that nothing was broken. The system was functioning exactly as designed, and I was cooperating with it. That was the shift. Not outrage, accountability. I saw that my silence wasn't neutral. It was participatory. Every time I absorbed something quietly, I made it easier for the next adjustment to happen. Every time I chose composure over clarity, I taught people what they could take. This wasn't about being underestimated. It was about being correctly assessed, as someone who would continue to perform without demanding alignment. I didn't feel betrayed, I felt responsible. That's a hard thing to admit. It's much easier to locate fault entirely outside yourself. But the truth was more nuanced. I had values, professionalism, loyalty, restraint, that I wore like armor. And that armor had protected me emotionally, but it had also made me predictable. I closed the report, not angrily, deliberately. For the rest of the day, I moved through my work as usual, answered questions, attended meetings, smiled when appropriate. No one noticed anything different, and that too was instructive. The shift was internal. I stopped assuming that being essential would eventually make me valued in the ways that mattered. I stopped believing that patience alone was a strategy. And I stopped waiting for recognition to arrive as a reward for endurance. Instead, I started observing more carefully. I paid attention to what the organization protected and what it didn't. To who had leverage and how they used it. To what information was shared casually and what was guarded. I began to see the informal power structures that existed beneath the official ones. Not with resentment, with interest. I didn't decide anything that day. I didn't make plans or promises to myself. I just allowed one idea to settle quietly and permanently. If I was going to continue giving this much of myself, it would no longer be without intention. Silence would no longer be automatic. It would be chosen, or not at all. And once silence becomes a choice, it stops being weakness. After that day, nothing changed on the surface, and everything changed underneath. I didn't announce a shift. I didn't correct anyone. I didn't suddenly start speaking more in meetings or asserting myself in obvious ways. That would have been visible, and visibility, I had learned, often invites premature resistance. Instead, I became intentional. When requests came in, I paused before responding. Not long enough to raise suspicion, just long enough to consider what each request assumed, what it took for granted, what it offered in return. Silence, when it's unconscious, is surrender. Silence, when it's deliberate, is positioning. I still said yes to many things, but I stopped saying yes reflexively. I asked clarifying questions that revealed scope without challenging authority. I let others sit with ambiguity instead of rushing to resolve it for them. I documented more carefully, not just outcomes, but dependencies. Who needed what? Who relied on which processes? Where decisions originated and where execution quietly landed. From the outside, I looked the same: calm, cooperative, reliable. Inside, I was mapping. What fascinated me was how quickly people filled the gaps I left. When I didn't immediately volunteer solutions, others spoke more, often exposing how little they actually understood. When I didn't preemptively smooth things over, small frictions surfaced. Not catastrophes, just enough to be noticed. And still, no one confronted me. They mistook my restraint for continued compliance. That misunderstanding gave me space. I began to see how much of the organization's stability rested on unspoken knowledge. Knowledge I held. Workflows that existed only because I remembered them. Relationships that functioned because I maintained them quietly. Historical context that explained why things were done a certain way, even if no one else remembered deciding it. None of this was malicious, but it was fragile. And fragility creates leverage, whether anyone acknowledges it or not. I didn't exploit that leverage. Not yet. I simply respected it. I stopped giving it away freely. I stopped packaging it neatly so others could use it without understanding it. There's a difference between being helpful and being self-erasing. I had crossed that line years ago without realizing it. As weeks passed, I noticed subtle shifts. People checked in more, asked how busy I was, framed requests more carefully. Nothing dramatic, just a slight recalibration, like a system adjusting to new data. I hadn't changed my tone. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't demanded anything. All I had done was stop cushioning everyone else's discomfort at the expense of my own clarity. It was tempting, at times, to push further, to correct misattributions, to claim space explicitly. But I resisted that urge, not out of fear, but out of strategy. I wasn't ready to be visible yet. Visibility without leverage is just exposure. What I needed first was understanding, so I kept watching, listening, learning. And the more I observed, the clearer it became that the bonus cut wasn't an anomaly. It was a signal, one that I had finally chosen to read. Silence had kept me safe. Choice was giving me control. What they never noticed was how much of the organization lived between the lines. Not in official charts or polished documents, but in habits, shortcuts, and quiet dependencies that formed over time. And because I had been the one smoothing those edges for years, I was also the one who understood how they fit together. Once I stopped rushing to maintain that invisible architecture, I began to see it clearly. I started with my notebook, the one I'd carried for years without much thought. It held more than meeting notes. It held timelines, decisions that were never formally recorded, compromises that had been made under pressure and then quietly forgotten. It held names next to actions, promises next to outcomes. I didn't add anything new. I just organized what already existed. I traced processes back to their origin. Not the official origin, the one in the deck, but the real one. Who had asked for what? Why certain safeguards existed? Which shortcuts were compensating for which structural gaps? Where risk was being absorbed rather than resolved. And slowly, a picture emerged. The company wasn't as streamlined as it believed. It functioned because certain people, myself included, held context that prevented small cracks from widening. When those people anticipated problems, leadership felt effective. When those people stayed silent, friction appeared. What struck me most was how unprotected that knowledge was. No redundancy, no documentation that captured nuance, no succession planning that accounted for informal power. It wasn't that leadership didn't care, it was that they assumed continuity. They assumed I would always be there, so I prepared, not for departure but for clarity. I began documenting processes in neutral language. Not exposés, not manifestos, just clear descriptions of how things actually worked. I kept copies of communications that showed how decisions were framed versus how they were executed. I noted where responsibilities were implied rather than assigned. This wasn't about building a case against anyone. It was about understanding my position accurately. And what I understood was this: my value wasn't in my effort. It was in my memory. Memory of why things existed. Memory of what broke when certain steps were skipped. Memory of who had agreed to what and when. That kind of memory is invisible until it's missing. I also paid attention to myself, to how often I had minimized my own contributions to maintain harmony, to how often I had filled gaps without asking why they existed, to how comfortable others had become with my quiet competence. None of this made me bitter. It made me precise. I realized that preparation didn't have to be aggressive to be effective. It just had to be thorough. And because I wasn't acting out of anger, I could move patiently, thoughtfully. They never noticed the shift because it didn't disrupt anything. Work continued. Deadlines were met. Meetings were attended. I didn't withdraw effort. I refined it. And in that refinement, I stopped being a buffer and started being a node, a point where information passed through and could be traced. By the time I finished organizing what I knew, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time at work. Not power, not satisfaction. Alignment. I finally understood where I stood, what I carried, and what it meant. And once you see that clearly, the next question becomes unavoidable. What are you willing to do with that knowledge? The reveal didn't come with a rush of adrenaline. There was no moment where I sat back and thought, so this is it. It arrived quietly, as most truths do, when you finally stop resisting them. I was reviewing my notes one evening at home, not for any immediate reason, just to make sure I understood them cleanly. As I read through the timelines, the dependencies, the undocumented decisions, something settled into focus. I wasn't just informed, I was central, not in title, not in hierarchy, but in function. Entire workflows depended on my judgment calls. Judgment calls I had been making so instinctively that no one had thought to formalize them. There were processes that existed only because I remembered why they had been built a certain way. There were relationships that stayed intact because I knew when to intervene quietly and when to step back. And there were risks that leadership didn't see, not because they were hidden, but because someone had always been standing between the risk and the consequence. That someone had been me. The bonus cut, the praise, the expanding expectations, they all clicked into place. I hadn't been overlooked. I had been optimized, rewarded just enough to stay, trusted just enough to carry weight, undervalued just enough to remain compliant. Seeing that wasn't painful. It was clarifying. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel angry. What I felt was calm. A deep, steady calm that comes when confusion finally dissolves. Because once you understand the leverage you hold, you also understand the responsibility that comes with it. Not responsibility to the company, but to yourself. I saw that I had options, not fantasies. Real, concrete options. Paths that didn't require threats or ultimatums. Paths that didn't require burning bridges or proving anyone wrong, just alignment. I also saw what I didn't want to do. I didn't want to expose anyone. I didn't want to embarrass leadership or force a dramatic reckoning. That kind of resolution would have been emotionally satisfying for a moment, and strategically short-lived. What I wanted was something quieter, more durable. I wanted to stop being misread. The reveal wasn't that I had power over them. It was that I had power over my participation. And that power didn't need to be announced to be effective. I closed my notebook and sat with that understanding for a long time. Not planning, not rehearsing conversations, just letting the clarity settle into my body. This wasn't about winning. It was about choosing, deliberately, what I would no longer subsidize with my silence. Once that choice becomes visible to you, even privately, there's no going back to innocence. Only direction. Clarity is uncomfortable, not because it's confusing, but because it removes excuses. Once I understood my position, I couldn't pretend anymore that staying was neutral. Every option in front of me carried weight now. Every path meant something would change, either internally or externally. For the first time, I allowed myself to consider all of them honestly. I could confront leadership directly. Lay out the mismatch between praise and compensation. Ask for a correction. On paper, it was the most straightforward option. It would have been professional, justified, even expected. But I knew the shape of that conversation before it happened. There would be nods, language about constraints, assurances about future cycles, and subtle recalibration afterward. My calm professionalism reframed as disappointment, my clarity reframed as sensitivity. I would be heard. I would not be changed. I could leave quietly, find another role, carry my experience elsewhere. That option was tempting in its simplicity. No conflict, no explanation, just movement. But as I considered it, something felt unresolved. Leaving without recalibrating the narrative would preserve the same misunderstanding that had allowed this situation to exist. I would exit as I had lived there. Useful, quiet, replaceable in theory, irreplaceable in practice. And the pattern would continue, for whoever stepped into the space I left behind. I could also stay exactly as I was. Accept the trade-off consciously. Let go of expectations around fairness and treat the role as transactional. Do the work, take the praise, absorb the cost. There was a strange peace in that option too, but it required a kind of emotional numbness I wasn't willing to cultivate. That left one option, the irreversible one, not confrontation, not departure, not compliance. Repositioning. I decided I would continue working there, but no longer as a buffer. No longer as a silent stabilizer. I would do my job precisely as defined, not as implicitly expanded. I would stop absorbing ambiguity for others. I would allow the system to experience its own friction. This wasn't sabotage. It wasn't withdrawal. It was alignment. I would give exactly what was asked, and no longer give what was assumed. That decision felt quiet, but it was decisive. Because once you stop compensating for structural gaps, those gaps become visible. And once they're visible, they have to be addressed by someone. I knew this choice would change how I was perceived. I knew it might lead to tension, confusion, even disappointment. But it was the only option that didn't require me to betray my own clarity. I didn't make the decision in a rush. I made it slowly, deliberately, with full awareness of its consequences. And once it was made, I felt something settle into place. Not relief, resolve. From that point on, I wasn't waiting for fairness. I was creating conditions where fairness became necessary. And that changed everything. Repositioning doesn't announce itself. It shows up as absence where overextension used to be. I didn't change my schedule. I didn't withdraw from meetings. I didn't suddenly become rigid or uncooperative. What changed was subtler and far more disruptive. I began working strictly within definition. When a request came in, I asked one simple question before acting. Is this actually mine to solve? If the answer was yes, I handled it cleanly. If the answer was unclear, I didn't rush to clarify it for others. I let the ambiguity remain theirs. I stopped anticipating problems that weren't officially assigned to me. Not out of spite, but out of accuracy. Anticipation had been my unpaid labor for years. It made other people look decisive and the system look stable. Without it, timelines stretched. Dependencies surfaced. Questions traveled upward instead of sideways. Still, no one noticed me doing anything wrong. Because I wasn't. I met deadlines. I communicated clearly. I documented decisions. I followed processes, especially the ones leadership liked to believe existed. When something fell outside scope, I redirected it politely. When decisions lacked clarity, I asked for it. In writing. Silence again did most of the work. The organization was used to me translating intent into execution. Without that translation, intent began to wobble. Meetings ended with less certainty. Follow-ups multiplied. People started circling back on decisions they thought were settled. At first, it was brushed off as growing pains. Then patterns emerged. Projects that once flowed smoothly began to stall at handoffs. Questions that used to die quietly on my desk now surfaced in leadership threads. Small delays created visibility where none had existed before. And still, I said nothing. I didn't point out what was missing. I didn't remind anyone of how things used to run. I let the system feel the difference without narration. What surprised me was how quickly others began to feel unsettled. Not angry, not confrontational, just disoriented. The absence of friction had been so normalized that its return felt like a failure rather than a signal. People checked in more often, asked if everything was okay. I assured them it was. And it was. For me. Because for the first time in years, my work matched my role. My effort matched my compensation. My silence matched my intention. I wasn't punishing anyone. I wasn't withholding value. I was simply no longer donating it invisibly. And in systems built on invisible labor, that alone is enough to change the temperature. The first consequence wasn't dramatic. It was confusion. Emails started looping in more people than necessary. Meetings were scheduled to answer questions that used to resolve themselves. Leaders asked for updates on things they hadn't needed updates on before. Not because I had failed, but because the system no longer smoothed over its own gaps. At first, the discomfort was diffuse. No one knew where to place it. People assumed someone else had dropped the ball, or that priorities had shifted, or that growth was simply making things more complex. These explanations were comforting because they didn't require anyone to look too closely at how work had actually been getting done. But slowly a pattern formed. Certain processes kept surfacing. The same ones. The ones I had historically overseen without calling attention to myself. When they faltered, there was no single person to blame. Just a sense that something essential was missing. Still, my name wasn't attached to the problem. That's the paradox of invisible labor. When it disappears, the absence is felt, but the source remains unclear. What changed next was tone. Check-ins became more frequent, more careful. My manager asked if I was feeling overwhelmed. Leadership expressed appreciation again, this time with a faint edge of concern. I thanked them and said everything was manageable, which was true. I wasn't overwhelmed. I was precise. The work I was doing was well-defined. The work I wasn't doing had never been acknowledged as mine. And now that distinction mattered. Deadlines slipped. Not catastrophically, but enough to require explanation. Dependencies were exposed. People realized they didn't know who owned certain decisions. The confidence that used to accompany ambitious plans softened into hesitation. And all of this happened without a single confrontation. No raised voices, no ultimatums, no dramatic moments. Just a system adjusting to the absence of unpaid stabilization. What struck me most was how quickly leadership began trying to recreate the old conditions, without addressing why they'd existed. More checklists, more meetings, more messaging about alignment. None of it replaced the quiet judgment calls that had been happening for years. They were treating a structural issue like a communication problem, and I watched, not with satisfaction, but with interest. Because the consequences weren't personal. They weren't aimed at me. They were simply the result of removing an invisible support beam. I hadn't pushed the system. I had stepped out of its way, and now it was revealing itself. By the time leadership sensed that something was wrong, they were already late. Not late in a dramatic sense. No deadlines missed spectacularly. No clients lost overnight. But late in the way systems are late when they've ignored small signals for too long. The kind of late that shows up as tension in meetings, as cautious language where confidence used to be, as a growing feeling that effort was no longer producing the same results. At first, they couldn't name it. They spoke about complexity, about scaling pains, about how growth inevitably creates friction. These explanations were comfortable because they were impersonal. They didn't require anyone to reflect on specific choices or overlook dynamics. They framed the problem as environmental rather than structural. But the discomfort persisted. Calendars began to fill with alignment meetings, conversations designed not to decide anything, but to reassure everyone that decisions still existed. Slides multiplied. Documentation initiatives were announced. Ownership matrices were drafted, revised, and quietly ignored when they didn't map cleanly onto reality. What they were experiencing wasn't a lack of effort. People were working harder than ever. What they lacked was coherence. And coherence, I knew, had been quietly subsidized for years. I watched this unfold with a kind of detached attentiveness. Not satisfaction, not bitterness, just recognition. This was what happened when invisible labor stopped compensating for structural ambiguity. Leadership began reaching out more directly, not urgently, not yet, just gently, cautiously. My manager asked how I was feeling, asked if the workload had become too much, asked whether I needed support. The questions were sincere, but they were framed around the wrong assumption, that the issue was capacity, not misalignment. I told him I was doing well, that my workload felt manageable, that nothing felt overwhelming. All true. What I didn't say was that the work now felt proportionate for the first time in years. Soon after, I was invited into a conversation with a senior leader, one of those informal check-ins that pretends to be casual while quietly gathering intelligence. They asked for my perspective on where things felt less smooth lately, whether I had noticed any breakdowns, any risks. I chose my words carefully. I spoke about the importance of clear ownership, about how informal processes can become brittle if they're not revisited, about how reliance on institutional memory carries risk if it's not distributed intentionally. Everything I said was accurate. What I didn't offer was the missing layer, the intuitive adjustments, the anticipatory decisions, the connective judgment calls that had never been documented because they'd never been acknowledged as labor. Not because I was hiding them, but because no one was asking for that responsibility explicitly anymore. They were asking for advice, not accountability. Insight, not alignment. And that difference mattered. As weeks passed, the tone shifted again. The conversations grew more urgent. Leaders began referencing single points of failure. There was talk, never direct, always abstract, about making sure no one person held too much implicit influence over operations. That phrase stayed with me, implicit influence. For years, that influence had been convenient, invisible, free. Now that it was causing discomfort, it had become a risk to mitigate rather than a contribution to respect. They attempted to fix the problem procedurally. New tools were introduced. Responsibilities were redistributed on paper. Temporary owners were assigned to processes that had never truly belonged to anyone else. In theory, this should have stabilized things. In practice, it didn't, because tools don't replace judgment. And ownership without context is just a title. People followed the new processes mechanically, without understanding why certain steps existed or what they protected against. Edge cases multiplied. Exceptions clogged workflows. Questions escalated upward because no one felt confident making calls without historical context. The organization was experiencing something unfamiliar, the cost of its own assumptions. And still, no one said my name in the room. That's what made it unmistakable. This wasn't about blame, it was about absence. They felt the loss, but they couldn't locate it. Like noticing a building swaying without knowing which support beam had been removed. Eventually, the reach-outs became more explicit. Could I help document certain processes? Could I train others on how things used to work? Could I be more involved in smoothing transitions while new structures were put in place? Each request was framed as temporary, collaborative, appreciative, and each one quietly assumed that I would once again step into the role I had intentionally stepped out of. I didn't refuse. I responded with precision. I documented what existed formally. I explained what had been decided, when it had been decided, and by whom. I trained others on procedures, not instincts, on frameworks, not judgment. I shared what was mine to share, within scope. What I did not do was resume buffering, and that was the moment it became too late to fix things quietly. Because what leadership wanted was restoration. They wanted the system to feel the way it used to feel, without revisiting the conditions that had made that feeling possible. They wanted continuity without recalibration. But continuity is a relationship. It requires mutual recognition. You can't restore something you never acknowledged as existing. I could see the realization dawning slowly, unevenly. In the way conversations circled without resolving. In the way decisions were deferred instead of made. In the way people started asking, indirectly, whether I was still happy. That question, still happy, revealed everything. Happiness was never the issue. Alignment was. By then, whatever conversation might have corrected the course earlier would no longer land the same way. Trust had shifted. Perception had changed. The system had revealed its reliance too openly. This was no longer about a bonus or even about compensation. It was about a fundamental misjudgment of what I was providing, of why it mattered, and of how quietly it had been sustaining more than anyone realized. And once a misjudgment like that becomes visible, not emotionally, but operationally, it can't be smoothed over. It has to be reckoned with. But reckoning requires humility. And humility doesn't arrive easily in systems accustomed to mistaking silence for satisfaction. By the time they understood that, the window for an easy repair had closed. Not because I was unwilling, but because clarity had replaced convenience. And clarity changes the rules. The conversation finally happened on a Tuesday morning. No calendar drama. No ominous subject line. Just a brief message asking if I had time to talk. I said yes, because by then, there was nothing left to avoid. The room was quiet. Glass walls. Neutral tones. The kind of space designed to feel transparent while still holding power. My manager was there, along with one senior leader I hadn't worked closely with before. They smiled, thanked me for coming, spoke first. They didn't accuse me of anything. That was important. Instead, they spoke about changes, about how things felt different lately, about how certain processes weren't flowing the way they used to. They asked if I had noticed it too. I said yes. That seemed to surprise them. I didn't rush to explain. I let the silence do what it needed to do. Then I spoke calmly, evenly, without emphasis. I said that I had been doing exactly what my role required, that I was clear on my responsibilities, and that I felt good about the quality of my work. I said that I had noticed areas where ownership had historically been informal, and that those areas were now more visible. No blame, no emotion, just observation. They asked, carefully, whether I felt disengaged. I said no. They asked whether I felt undervalued. I paused, not for effect, for honesty. Then I said that I felt accurately valued now. That my effort and compensation were finally aligned. That the discomfort they were experiencing wasn't the result of me pulling back, but of the system no longer being quietly supplemented. The room went still. I could see them recalibrating. Not defensively, yet, but with a kind of dawning awareness. This wasn't a performance issue. It wasn't a morale issue. It wasn't something that could be fixed with reassurance. One of them mentioned the bonus cycle, framed it as an unfortunate constraint, spoke about trade-offs, about how appreciation sometimes shows up in non-monetary ways. I didn't argue. I simply said that appreciation had never been the problem, that I had heard the praise clearly, that what had changed was my understanding of what that praise represented. They asked what I wanted. That was the simplest question they had asked all year, and I answered it just as simply. I said I wanted clarity, clear scope, clear ownership, clear alignment between responsibility and reward. Not retroactively, not as a gesture. Structurally, there was no anger in my voice, no ultimatum, just a statement of conditions. I told them I wasn't asking for special treatment. I was asking not to be misread anymore. They nodded, took notes, promised to take this seriously, to explore options, to follow up. I believed them, within limits. Because the point of the conversation wasn't to secure an outcome, it was to remove ambiguity. To say, calmly and without heat, that the old arrangement no longer existed. When the meeting ended, there was no resolution, no raised voices, no sense of victory or loss, just a quiet acknowledgement that something fundamental had shifted. And that shift didn't belong to them anymore. It belonged to me. I didn't walk out of that conversation feeling triumphant. I walked out feeling settled, not because everything had been resolved, far from it, but because I was no longer carrying something that didn't belong to me. The weight I had been holding for years wasn't work. It was distortion. The quiet distortion of being seen incorrectly and compensating for it silently. Once that distortion was named, even briefly, it lost its grip. Who I am now isn't radically different from who I was then. I'm still calm, still observant, still deliberate in how I move through systems. I didn't become louder or sharper or more aggressive. I didn't trade restraint for dominance. What changed was internal alignment. I no longer confuse usefulness with worth. I no longer treat patience as proof of professionalism. And I no longer believe that being indispensable means being invisible. At work, my presence is cleaner now, more bounded. I contribute with intention, not reflex. I ask questions without apologizing for them. I let decisions belong to the people who make them. And when I speak, I don't soften the edges of clarity to protect someone else's comfort. Not because I'm hardened, because I'm precise. There's a calm confidence that comes from knowing exactly what you're responsible for and what you are not, from understanding where your influence actually lives rather than where it's symbolically acknowledged, from no longer waiting for validation to arrive in the form you were promised. I don't feel bitter toward the people who misjudged me. Misjudgment, I've learned, is often a byproduct of convenience. People see what works for them, not what it costs someone else. What I feel instead is respectful distance. Distance from narratives that rely on my silence. Distance from roles that expand without consent. Distance from systems that praise restraint while exploiting it. And in that distance, something unexpected emerged. Agency, not the dramatic kind that announces itself. The quiet kind that doesn't need permission. The kind that knows when to stay, when to shift, and when to leave, without needing to justify itself loudly. I'm no longer interested in being essential at the expense of being aligned. I don't need to be admired. I need to be clear. Clear in my boundaries, clear in my expectations, clear in my participation. That clarity didn't make me colder, it made me freer. And that freedom shows up everywhere now, not just at work, in how I listen, in how I say no, in how I allow silence to exist without rushing to fill it. I used to think strength meant endurance. Now I know it means discernment. I'm still Emma, just no longer misread. There's a temptation, at the end of stories like this, to offer a clean moral. Something simple, something motivational. But the truth is more layered than that, and I want to honor it honestly. What happened to me wasn't cruelty. It wasn't betrayal. And it wasn't the result of a single bad decision. It was the slow outcome of a system doing what it was allowed to do, and of a person, me, cooperating with that system longer than she should have. The applause was real. The appreciation was real. And still, it wasn't enough. Because recognition without alignment is not respect. It's maintenance. It keeps you functional while preventing you from becoming inconvenient. For a long time, I believed that if I stayed calm, capable, and committed, the system would eventually respond in kind. That patience would be rewarded. That fairness would emerge naturally. What I learned instead is that systems don't correct what doesn't disrupt them. And silence, no matter how dignified, rarely disrupts anything. That doesn't mean you need to become loud, or aggressive, or perform your frustration. It means you need to be accurate. Accurate about what you're giving. Accurate about what you're receiving. Accurate about whether the gap between the two is something you're choosing, or something you've been trained to tolerate. The most powerful shift in this story wasn't the confrontation. It wasn't the organizational discomfort. It was the moment I stopped donating my clarity in exchange for approval. Quiet dominance isn't about control over others. It's about control over your participation. When you stop cushioning systems that undervalue you, those systems are forced to reveal themselves. Some will adjust, some won't. But either way, you're no longer confused about where you stand. And that clarity is worth more than applause. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your perspective. Have you ever been praised publicly while being diminished privately? And how did you respond once you realized it? Your experiences matter more than neat conclusions. I'll be reading the comments.
Video hữu ích, hãy ấn like và đăng ký kênh để ủng hộ mình nhé. Chúng ta sẽ gặp nhau ở những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.